Hi, and welcome to The Briefing, a production of Now This in the Appeal. I'm Josie Duffy Rice, the president of the Appeal, and I am so excited and thrilled and honored to be here with Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders tonight. Thank you so much for joining us, Senator. So Senator Sanders is joining me to talk about what we are currently experiencing, which is the biggest crisis of our lifetimes. The effects of the coronavirus have cratered our economy, created human suffering that verges on Great Depression era bad. Almost 21 million jobs were lost last month alone. Hospitals are facing shortages of life-saving protective equipment. An incarceration crisis is hitting our jails, our prisons, our immigration detention centers that will translate into death by coronavirus sentences. And at the same time, this is a moment of generational opportunity, right? Amidst the crisis and fear, the fundamental story about our politics and the role of government in our country will change, and we will either shape or be shaped by it for the rest of our lives. So tonight we're going to talk about both the crisis and the opportunity of this moment, and we're going to discuss what we need to do going forward as a country to make sure that all of us, starting with the most vulnerable among us, come through the crisis and come back stronger afterward. Luckily, we have a person with us tonight who has a long history of trying to get our country to talk about and address these issues. And I'm looking forward to having a conversation with Senator Sanders about what we're learning, what we're doing, what we need to be doing, and where we can go from here. Thank you so much, Senator Sanders, for being here.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for summarizing the unique and unprecedented moment that we are in American history. And as you said, what we're dealing with now is not just a pandemic, which has claimed already at least 77,000 lives, but we're also dealing with an economic meltdown, which has cost us over the last 7 weeks, 30 million jobs. Unbelievable.
Right.
And that's where we are right now. We've got to figure our way out of it.
Yeah, you know, one of the most dominant political scripts of the past 40 years goes something like this. The government affirms human dignity and allows freedom to flourish, mostly by getting out of the way, right? Fewer regulations, less entitlement spending, fewer taxes. That's been what we've been told is the recipe for allowing people and communities to thrive. Before his election, Ronald Reagan called this the starve the beast strategy, right? And Grover Norquist encapsulated the strategy best when he said, my goal is to cut the government in half in 25 years to get it down to the size where we can drown it in a bathtub. And now we're in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. The shortcomings of this approach are more laid bare than ever. And how would you say you think this moment kind of highlights these failures of the past 40 plus years?
It does in so many ways. And you're right, it lays bare, it exposes all of the inequities, all of the inadequacies of our current political and economic system. All right, so you start with the simple fact. 30 million workers have lost their jobs. That's bad. And yet millions of those workers have also lost their health care because their health care was attached to their jobs rather than being seen, as is the case in every other major country, as a human right. So one lesson to be learned is that health care is a right for all people, not just a job benefit. We need Medicare for all. Second of all, you would think that in the richest country on earth, where we spend twice as much per capita on healthcare as other nations, that in the midst of a pandemic, our doctors and our nurses might have face masks and gloves and gowns to protect them. You might think that is not a radical concept, and yet tragically, that has not been the case. You might think that in the midst of a pandemic, we would not be firing or laying off thousands of doctors and nurses, but trying to get more people involved in addressing the crisis. So that's healthcare. In terms of the economy, I think the simple question to be asked is, how does it happen that in the midst of a major meltdown, so many of our people find themselves in absolute desperation if they don't get a check for a week or two? How come they don't have 50,000 bucks in the bank to say, oh, this is tough, but I have the money to get through? And millions of people are now facing hunger because they lived on $12 an hour. And you know what? You got nothing in the bank. That check stops you're in desperation. Those are two of many areas. The third area, if I might, deals with the systemic racism in our society. Who are the people who are getting laid off at the fastest rate? Black and brown. Who are the people forced to go to work in dangerous jobs? Black and brown. Who are the people who are suffering the most financially and healthcare wise because of the pre-existing conditions they had, which laid them open for this virus because they have not had the healthcare that they've needed in the past. So we're seeing that play out as well.
Yeah, I think you're highlighting something that we've been talking about a lot, right? Which is that on one hand, the coronavirus kind of underscores our shared vulnerability and our shared interdependence. The virus itself doesn't care about prison walls. It doesn't care if you're a wealthy CEO or working on the factory floor. But on the other hand, it's really not hitting us all equally. And poor people and people of color are suffering disproportionately, not just from the virus, but from the aftermath of the virus. And deep structural racism, as you said, means that we're also not impacted equally. We hear people talk about freedom a lot in this moment as if freedom is always shaped by the absence of government involvement and intervention. But this is in many ways a misconception, right? Vigorous government mobilization can be a way to reduce vulnerability.
Well, Josie, let's deal with that issue. And thank you for framing it the way you did. If I am sick and I can't afford to go to a doctor, am I free?
Right.
If I am dealing with incredible stress, because even in normal times, I don't have enough money to take adequate care of my kids or provide for decent childcare for my kids. Am I living free? Am I free? If I am 75 years of age trying to get by on $12,000 a year Social Security, am I free? So I would redefine, I think you described the different perspectives. I would say that freedom has a lot to do with security.
Right.
With the knowledge that, you know what, you're earning a decent living, that you can go to a doctor when you need to, that your kid is going to get a good education. You don't have to worry about how you're going to be able to afford college, or if you're a student, go deeply in debt. So it's a redefinition, I think, of what human freedom is about.
Yeah, I think there's a question right now about if this is the moment to push for progressive change. And it seems like this is an opportunity to redefine what freedom is and how government can help ensure freedom, ensure dignity, and reduce vulnerability as a way of ensuring freedom versus just getting out of the way, and that's seen as freedom by itself.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And what we are learning in the midst of this terrible, terrible crisis, people are not running to Wall Street for help. They're demanding that their local, state, and federal government respond to their needs, which is appropriate in a democracy. So I think what we have got to think about and move towards is, how do we make sure that all of our people, regardless of the color of their skin, whether they're documented or undocumented, whether they're living in a rural part of the country or in an urban part of the country, how do all of our people get the basic necessities of life? Is it too much to say that I say to you that government should guarantee you the opportunity to have a decent paying job? Is that a radical idea? I don't think it is. There's an enormous amount of work that has to be done. We need great teachers. We need more doctors, nurses, dentists, childcare workers. We need to rebuild our infrastructure. We need to create millions of jobs, saving the planet from the ravages of climate change. So if I say to you that by law, you're entitled, if you're able to work, to a decent paying job, that's not a radical idea. Should I say to you that you're entitled as a human being to get health care and be able to go to the doctor and hospital whenever you need without having to pay for it out of your own pocket? I don't think that's what every other major country on earth is doing. Is it a radical idea to say that in the year 2020, all of our people should have the opportunity to get the education that they need in order to fulfill their dreams? Is that really a radical idea? I don't think so. But when some of these folks talk about freedom, getting the government off of our backs, Turns out that they like a system in which three people own more wealth than the bottom half of American society.
Right.
Okay, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is exactly the kind of issue we need to be debating, and I think now is the time to do that.
So we've talked about the need for government to take action, to commit resources to providing the basic things everyday people need to live a stable and dignified life. And the fact that we don't have basics like Medicare for all might make a person here or someone kind of observing America think that we don't have big government interventions, right? But that's not true. And one of the biggest government interventions we know of is mass incarceration, right? It's one of the biggest government programs in this country, and it has caused an incarceration crisis that has never before been seen in this scale anywhere in the history of the world, right? Over 2 million people locked up in prison in the United States, and at least 10 million more cycling in and out of jail every year. So why have we been so willing to fund government programs like mass incarceration when we won't fund basic necessities like healthcare? Not to ask you to read the minds of.
Well, and by the way, when you say over 2 million people, you're right. That's local, state, federal. We are spending $80 billion a year to lock people up. And one of the insane aspects of this mass incarceration is that about 20% of the people behind bars today have not been convicted of anything. They just can't afford bail. It's like a debtor's prison, which is literally beyond words crazy. I think what you have is a very vicious circle here, where instead of doing what most other industrialized countries do, which is invest in their kids to make sure that young people have the education and the jobs they need, we do not do that. So you got school districts all over this country, which are underfunded, inadequate educational opportunities for kids. Kids are dropping out of school and they're getting into trouble. They get into trouble and then we lock them up and we spend $60,000 a year locking people up rather than giving them the education and the jobs that they need. And it becomes a political issue because you got right-wing politicians who are going to be tough on crime. They're going to throw away the key, et cetera, et cetera. But I think what you are beginning to see, because of a lot of great work done by Black Lives Matter, the ACLU, folks like Sean King and others, is the absurdity and the irrationality of that approach. And by the way, you're seeing some conservatives oppose this mass incarceration because they say, should we really be spending $80 billion a year locking people up? Is that a good investment for America? So I think we're making some progress in that area. Obviously, we have an enormous way to go.
Right. And now we see that the coronavirus pandemic has kind of caused a crisis in a crisis, right? Prisons are overcrowded, so social distancing is a near impossibility. Many people locked inside don't have regular access to soap and water, or if they have access, they have to pay an exorbitant amount of money that they don't have. The coronavirus is hitting people who are confined to prisons, but also those who work in prisons who are then taking this virus back to their families, to their communities. The latest data from the New York Times, 7 of the largest 10 clusters of coronavirus cases are in prisons or jails. We recently heard the story of Andrea Circle Bear, who was just 30 years old when she died a few weeks ago of the coronavirus. She was pregnant when she was sent to federal prison in Texas on a drug charge. She gave birth while on a ventilator. Her baby survived, but she did not. She will never know her baby. Her baby will never know her mother. And it's, again, not just these individuals who are confined, who are affected, it's people who work in these institutions. Public health experts are very clearly saying that we need to reduce the prison population to slow the spread. But we see government officials on both parties, both the Democratic and Republican parties, governors across the country, mayors across the country, who are not taking the action necessary. What do you think that states and governors should be doing to better address the fact that our addiction to mass incarceration has created this worst possible scenario in prisons?
It is, again, hard to imagine somebody arrested for whatever reason, maybe a serious crime, maybe a nonviolent crime, now literally facing a death sentence because they are in a situation in jail where they're interacting with other people. We know, last I heard, some 300 inmates have already died. You're right, a number of guards have also died. Some 20,000 prisoners are infected. So I think what we've got to do is to say, get people out of jail when we can. Those people who are older, who are more vulnerable to disease, let's get them out of prison when we can. Let us get the nonviolent people. Let us do our best to reduce the inmate population at this particular moment. I think in my own state, we have reduced the population by about 15%. Don't quote me on that, precisely for that reason. And that's what I think we should be doing all across this country.
You know, you mentioned, and I think it's true, that we aren't seeing enough change in the prison population, but it isn't all bad news, right? At the local level, we're seeing jail populations that are dramatically down, over 50% in some places. We're seeing cities that are putting people experiencing homelessness in hotel rooms instead of encampments. There's proposed legislation by Congresswoman Tlaib, Senator Kamala Harris, and you to provide monthly direct payments to everyone in America. So I want to step back and end by focusing again on the opportunity of this moment, because I think there is opportunity here in this, in what is deeply tragic, deeply unpredictable and scary. We also have an opportunity for change. So what gives you hope in this moment? And what do you think we need to learn from this moment and do to make what comes after this better?
We need to take a deep breath and ask ourselves how we got to where we are. And this is above and beyond the dysfunctional president who we have, but even beyond that. And raise the issues of the power structure of America, something which we don't talk about in Congress very much or on corporate media. How do so few people have so much political and economic power? That's fundamental. Let's talk about that. So what about the priorities? Why are we locking up people and yet have a child care system which is totally inadequate? Why do we see almost 50% of all new income going to the top 1% while 500,000 people are homeless today? We got to start asking those simple questions about justice. That's number one. Number two, what we don't do often as Americans is take a look around the rest of the world. I am talking to you right now from Burlington, Vermont, 50 miles away from the Canadian border. In Canada, they spend half as much per person on healthcare as we do, yet they manage to provide quality care to all of their people. How does that happen? Why don't we do that? Why do we pay in some cases 10 times more for prescription drugs than Canadians and people in other countries? Why in the richest country in the history of the world are so many people living in desperation? How do you create an economy that works for all? How do you create jobs combating climate change through a Green New Deal, et cetera, et cetera? So I think this is the moment to take a look at what's going on around us, see the incredible inequities, the incredible amount of suffering, the racial disparities, and try to think about how we got here and where we want to go into the future. And if there is anything positive about this terrible, terrible moment, it is just that. Think about how we got here. Think about what freedom really means. Think about where we want to be in the future.
Senator Sanders, thank you so much for joining us at the briefing. We're so grateful to have you on. And thank you so much for being a guest of ours.
Well, thank you. You guys keep up the great work.
Thank you. This has been The Briefing. I'm Josie Duffy Rice. Join us on Monday. And thank you for tuning in.
Hey, Josie, that was great.